He thought it was just another routine stop. Another black man, another assumption. But when Officer Garrett Mason demanded ID, he didn't realize he was cuffing the man who'd soon control his entire career. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story, it is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move, challenge you or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now let's get into the story. The sirens didn't wail. The lights didn't flash. There was no high-speed chase, no urgent call for backup. Just a silent pull to the curb on a quiet stretch of 6th Street in downtown Austin. The kind of moment that passes unnoticed by most, but leaves a scar when you're on the receiving end. Officer Garrett Mason didn't feel nervous. He never did. 11 years on the force had trained out the tremors, replaced them with certainty, that bone-deep confidence that he knew what danger looked like. And this man, standing alone beside a black Lincoln SUV, phone in hand, waiting, watching, calm as the air around him. Something about him didn't sit right. Garrett stepped out of his cruiser, hand brushing the grip of his holstered weapon, more out of habit than necessity. "Excuse me, sir," he called, his tone clipped, authoritative. "Can I see some ID?" The man looked up, his expression unreadable. He was tall, well-dressed, maybe early 40s. Navy blue suit, a leather satchel over one shoulder. "Is there a problem, officer?" Garrett didn't answer right away. He hated that question. It flipped the power dynamic too quickly, made him feel like the one under scrutiny. "You match the description of a suspect reported nearby. Loitering, possibly casing vehicles." There was a pause. "I'm waiting for a meeting downtown," the man said slowly. "Standing by my own car." "ID, please." The man hesitated, just for a second. Then he reached into his inner coat pocket and handed Garrett a black leather wallet. Inside, a driver's license, a business card, and a federal ID badge. Malik T. Lawson, Office of Civil Oversight. Garrett barely registered the words. His brain focused on the tension in the air, the unspoken narrative playing out behind his badge. Another black man, in a place he didn't belong, at least not without explanation. Training told him to trust instincts. His instincts, however, had been fed by years of unchecked assumptions. Malik said nothing as Garrett held his ID a little too long, as if searching for a crack in the credentials. Finally, Garrett handed it back, nodded stiffly, and said, "You're free to go." Malik didn't smile. He didn't say thank you. He simply returned the ID to his coat, looked Garrett in the eye, and said, "We'll see each other again." Garrett watched him walk away, the words clinging to him like smoke. The next morning, Garrett stood in full uniform in the department's main conference room. A welcome breakfast for the new director of oversight had been scheduled weeks ago, and most of the force was expected to be present. Coffee stale, pastries, the smell of floor wax. Nothing unusual. Until Chief Donovan stood at the podium and cleared his throat. "I want to officially welcome the new Director of Civil Oversight, who will be working closely with our department moving forward. He's been a federal consultant, a DOJ investigator, and a respected advocate for police reform across the country." He paused. "Please join me in welcoming Mr. Malik Lawson." Garrett felt the blood drain from his face. He turned slowly, and there he was. The man he had pulled over. The man he had profiled. Now, walking into the room With the poise of someone who knew exactly where he belonged, Malik shook hands, exchanged greetings, and took the front seat, as if he had never stood on a cold sidewalk with cuffs just a breath away. As if yesterday had never happened. But Garrett knew better, and Malik hadn't forgotten. Because the thing about power is it moves. And sometimes, when you least expect it, the man you assumed was beneath you turns out to be holding the pen that writes your evaluation. For the rest of the meeting, Garrett sat still, his thoughts racing. Not out of guilt, at least not yet, but out of something far more dangerous for a man like him: doubt. He had never questioned the script before, the way he scanned crowds, the way his eyes settled quicker on certain faces. It was procedure. It was policy. It was what he was trained to do. Wasn't it? But sitting across from Malik, calm, composed, and now in a position of authority over every report Garrett filed, he began to feel the weight of something heavier than suspicion. Accountability. What would happen next, he didn't know. But this much was clear: the stop on 6th Street hadn't ended on the sidewalk. It had only just begun. And Malik Lawson. He wasn't here for revenge. He was here to watch, to listen, to change the game, one officer at a time. And Garrett Mason. He just became the first name on the list. By the time Officer Brandon Coyle finished his 3rd cup of bitter station coffee, the city of Savannah had already begun to stir windows, lighting up in narrow row houses, street vendors setting up shop along River Street, and a cool mist clinging to the iron balconies like a memory that refused to lift. It was a routine morning for most. But for Brandon, routine was a fortress. Inside it, nothing questioned him. Nothing cracked through the armor he'd spent 2 decades perfecting. That armor pressed into every inch of his uniform wasn't just about authority. It was about order, about control. Brandon Coyle was not a monster. That was what he told himself on quiet nights when the body cam footage flickered in his mind and the echo of "I didn't do anything" reverberated off the inside of his skull. He had served on the force for 21 years. Commendations, promotions, the face of respectable policing in Chatham County. But under the polished surface, there was something more complicated than medals and mandates. His father had worn the badge before him, a man of disciplined rules and unyielding silence. As a child, Brandon had grown up learning not to question, but to comply. Every infraction, no matter how small, was corrected with a lesson. There's no such thing as gray area. In duty, his father used to say, tapping a folded newspaper as if headlines were gospel. Brandon listened. Brandon obeyed. And when it came time, Brandon followed in those boots, believing that justice was simple: keep the streets clean, follow the protocol, and never show weakness. But the badge didn't erase the shadows it cast. There were nights when Brandon couldn't sleep, not because of violence, but because of doubt. He'd see the faces black men mostly, whom he'd stopped on street corners told to put their hands up, ask the same questions in the same tone. Where are you going? What's in the bag? Got any priors? The procedure never changed, even if the lives did. He didn't think of himself as racist. That was the word. He bristled at the accusation that sparked anger instead of reflection. He believed in colorblind policing, believed that people should just comply, that if they just followed directions, everything would be fine. But deep down, he had learned to associate certain things with danger: hoodies pulled tight, lingering eyes, quiet stares that held something unreadable. And it was in those unreadable moments that Brandon's fear wore the mask of suspicion. He'd once told a rookie, "You have to learn to read people fast. A hesitation can get you killed." It sounded wise, practical, but what he didn't say was that sometimes he didn't know what he was reading. Sometimes the face didn't match the threat. Sometimes there was no threat at all. Still, Brandon had a record to uphold. He was slated for promotion, chief deputy, maybe even the top chair in the department, if the next election went the way everyone expected. His commanding officer trusted him. The mayor had once shaken his hand at a community safety forum. Parents brought their kids to meet him during school safety week. He'd become the image of what policing was supposed to look like, clean cut by the book and unwavering. But images lie. Because behind Brandon's crisp uniform, there were reports buried deeper than most would care to dig. Complaints filed and dismissed. A handful of footage clips listed as unavailable due to technical glitches. Internal notes that read, "Officer followed procedure," with a signature stamped beneath them like a shield. There was nothing illegal, nothing overt, just a pattern that grew too slowly to catch. A pattern Brandon never questioned because it protected him as much as he protected it. He told himself he was tired, that the tension was just burnout, that everyone made mistakes, that the man outside the cafe last week, the one in the navy coat, had looked suspicious, that the call came in for a black male mid-50s loitering, that he didn't have to feel bad about it because he followed the call. But somewhere inside, something was starting to shift. Not guilt, not yet. Just the kind of unrest that creeps in through the cracks you didn't realize had formed. He hadn't expected the man to be so calm. He hadn't expected silence to feel louder than protest. He hadn't expected the oversight call to come within hours. And he certainly hadn't expected the name Malcolm Ayers to show up in his inbox the next day with a title attached that made his stomach turn Deputy Director Office of Civil Accountability. The man he cuffed. The man whose phone he dismissed. The man whose ID he never asked to see. That man was now his new boss. No one had said it out loud yet. No press releases. No formal announcements. But Brandon had seen the eyes in the hallway. He'd heard the whispers. Something was coming, and it wasn't a reprimand. It was a reckoning. And for the first time in years, Brandon wasn't sure what came next. He walked through the precinct slower that day, not because his steps were heavy, but because they had started to carry weight he couldn't unload. Every door he passed, every officer who glanced up, every memo pinned to the board felt like it had eyes, watching, measuring, and in the back of his mind, one question looped quiet but relentless. Who are you when the badge no longer protects you from the truth? Brandon didn't have an answer. Not yet. But he was starting to understand that the badge could cover a lot. Until it couldn't. The storm didn't arrive with thunder. It came in whispers. At the Savannah Police Department, the air had changed. Not in temperature or scent, but in pressure, like the walls were listening, like the floor held secrets too delicate to speak aloud. Officer Brandon Coyle could feel it even before he entered the building that morning. The front desk sergeant didn't look him in the eye. The morning roll call felt clipped sterile, and the usual nods from fellow officers were replaced with silence, tight-lipped, half-glanced silence. He was still wearing the same badge, still driving the same cruiser. But something had shifted around him, and now even the badge felt heavier. 2 days had passed since Malcolm Ayers walked into the precinct. Not in handcuffs, but in a tailored charcoal suit flanked by 2 aides and armed with a folder that didn't carry complaint forms but authority. Brandon had watched from the edge of the squad room as Malcolm introduced himself to the chief, shaking hands with the kind of quiet that could stop a room. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Everyone already knew who he was. The man who had been mistaken, cuffed, dismissed. The man whose title now gave him the power to reshape what had once been untouchable. Brandon had not spoken to him directly since that morning outside the Blue Fig Cafe. Not because he wasn't allowed to, but because he didn't know what to say. How do you apologize for a mistake you never truly believed you'd made? How do you address a man you'd once dismissed as a suspicious loiterer when he now had clearance to audit every action you've ever taken? The review began without announcement. Internal files requested. Body cam footage archived and reviewed. Dispatch logs quietly pulled. It wasn't a dramatic purge, it was surgical. And it wasn't just Brandon under scrutiny. A quiet unease spread through the ranks as officers began to wonder who else might be listed in the documents Malcolm now carried. But Brandon felt it more personally, because this wasn't just about protocol. It was about a moment, a single moment, when he looked at a man and saw suspicion instead of humanity. That moment had cracked something open, and now every step Brandon took inside the department felt like walking on the edge of a mirror, unsure when it would shatter. The hardest part wasn't the silence, it was the reflection. Late at night, Brandon began replaying scenes in his head. Not just the recent one, but others. A teenager on the hood of his patrol car crying and saying he didn't do anything. A woman forced to prove she lived in her own apartment building. A man in a suit questioning why he was pulled over only for Brandon to shrug it off, with a citation for a taillight he never actually checked. He used to tell himself he was just doing his job, that if people complied, things wouldn't escalate. But now, those moments clung to him. They weren't just isolated. They were linked by tone, by instinct, by something darker he never wanted to name. Malcolm never confronted him. He didn't pull rank. He didn't request an apology. Instead, he did something far more disarming. He listened. In every review meeting, every oversight debrief, Malcolm sat with stillness, not passive, purposeful. He didn't interrupt. He didn't accuse. He let the paperwork speak. The patterns, the missing footage, the reports that read too similarly to be coincidence, and that silence became unbearable. During one particular internal review, Malcolm sat across the table from Brandon and other officers, asking a single question that hung in the room like smoke. When you write your reports, do you ever write what you felt or just what you did? No one answered. Brandon certainly didn't. Because the truth was, he never documented the unease, the bias, the flashes of fear that informed his split-second decisions. And that omission wasn't just oversight. It was self-protection. The precinct itself began to change in response. A new poster was tacked up near the locker room. Procedural Review Hotline Confidential. Protected. Younger officers began to linger near it. Veterans kept their heads down. And Brandon? He stopped pretending not to notice. The most jarring moment came one morning when a rookie, fresh from the academy, bright-eyed and unscarred, asked Brandon during a routine patrol officer coil, "Do you ever wonder if we're wrong?" It wasn't an accusation, just a question. But it landed like a weight. Brandon wanted to say no to remind the kid that doubt gets you killed, that confidence is safety. But instead, he said nothing. Because for the first time, he didn't know the answer. Later that day, Brandon sat in his cruiser outside the same tea shop where it all began. The windows still fogged in the morning light, the paper bag from the blue fig still swinging from someone's wrist. A man stood there scrolling through his phone waiting, just like Malcolm had. Brandon didn't approach. He just watched. And in that man's stillness, he saw something that should have been obvious all along. Patience, not threat. Presence, not danger. He realized then that the reckoning wasn't external. It wasn't the hearings or the audits or the headlines that never came. It was internal, a quiet unraveling of certainty, a dismantling of the lens through which he had seen the world for decades. This was the moment the badge stopped being a shield and started becoming a mirror. Brandon still wore it, still served, but something in him had begun to bend, not break, but bend toward awareness. And that more than any consequence was what Malcolm had come to deliver. Not punishment, not revenge, just truth. And the space to finally feel it. The conference room on the third floor of Savannah's Municipal Oversight Building wasn't designed to intimidate, but it didn't need to. It was plain windowless, painted in the kind of beige that forgot its own name, with a humming overhead light that never quite stopped flickering. But it was here that the most consequential meeting of Brandon Coyle's career would take place. And for once, there was no shield, no squad car, no badge to buffer him from the truth. When he walked in, his steps weren't slow. They were deliberate. Not the way a man walks into a room with confidence, but the way someone enters a space knowing nothing familiar will greet him. His uniform was pressed, his nameplate polished, but his spine carried a tension that betrayed the calm. Across the table sat Malcolm Ayers. Not just the man he had detained weeks earlier, but the man now leading a formal departmental review that bore his name. The same Malcolm, who had remained silent in handcuffs, was now holding a stack of files with post-it tabs, paper clips, and neatly highlighted passages that mapped a pattern no one had ever wanted to see. Brandon sat nodding once, without making eye contact. Malcolm returned the gesture, not with coldness, but with composure, the kind that doesn't require power to assert itself. The room filled slowly, internal affairs officers, city legal counsel, and 2 civilian review board members. A glass pitcher of water sat untouched in the center of the table, sweating under the heat of tension. No one raised their voice. No one needed to. The meeting began with data charts, timestamps, body cam transcripts, all of it delivered without malice, only precision. The kind of precision that doesn't aim to punish, but to expose. One by one stops were outlined. Not just Brandon's, but a handful others. Stops that shared a through line, vague suspicion, lack of verification, and a heavy concentration in the city's black neighborhoods. But it wasn't the volume that cut through Brandon. It was the familiarity, the cadence of the reports, the clipped language, the circular justifications. He had written some of those lines himself, failed to comply, fit the description, standard protocol. They sounded less like facts now, and more like habits, habits shaped by fear training and the quiet comfort of never being questioned. Then came the moment that shifted the room. A video was played, body cam footage, grainy but clear. It wasn't the incident with Malcolm. It was from 3 years earlier. A man named Curtis Lane had been stopped while walking to work. The footage showed Brandon asking him to step aside to explain himself to produce ID. Lane had hesitated not out of guilt, but confusion. He had worked that job for 6 years. Everyone on that street knew his name. The video didn't show violence, no force, no shouting. Just a man slowly shrinking under suspicion, repeating the words, "I'm just trying to get to work," over and over again like a prayer. When the screen went dark, no one spoke for several seconds. The silence was louder than any verdict. It was then Malcolm leaned forward, folding his hands, without notes in front of him. "This meeting," he began, his voice steady, but not cold, "is not about your punishment. It's about your perspective." Brandon's jaw flexed, but he didn't speak. Malcolm continued, "You saw me outside that cafe and assumed danger. Not because I posed it, but because you've been taught to read stillness as threat when it looks like me." He paused, then added, "We teach patterns into our systems, Brandon, and if we don't unlearn them, we keep teaching harm." For the first time in the meeting, Brandon met his eyes, not with defiance, with something else, something raw. "I didn't mean to." He started, but the sentence caught in his throat. What came next wasn't denial. It was the truth catching up to him. Malcolm didn't interrupt. He let the silence finish what Brandon couldn't. Finally, Brandon asked, "What happens now?" Malcolm looked around the room, not for permission, but for witness. "We rewrite what's been left untouched for too long," he said. "This review won't end with a report. It ends when the practices change. When officers are retrained, when policies shift, when suspicion stops being an excuse for injustice." The legal counsel nodded, adding that the recommendation included mandatory cultural training, a 6-month field suspension for Brandon, and a supervised reinstatement only upon completion of all oversight directives. Brandon nodded slowly, not because he had to, because somewhere deep inside, a different kind of clarity was emerging. Before the meeting ended, Malcolm said one final thing, not to the room, but directly to Brandon. "You didn't just stop me that morning. You stopped seeing me. And I want you to know, I saw you. I saw a man, not angry, but afraid. And I think you're afraid of the wrong thing." The room dispersed slowly. People signed forms, collected binders, avoided too much eye contact. But Brandon stayed seated. He watched Malcolm leave not with triumph, but with the quiet dignity of someone who had come not to punish, but to rebuild something that had long been broken. And in that chair, long after the room had emptied, Brandon let himself feel something he had kept buried for too many years, not guilt, not shame, but responsibility. Real, unvarnished responsibility. And for the first time in his career, he understood that the most dangerous mistake he had ever made wasn't the stop. It was the certainty that nothing needed to change. That belief was gone now. In its place, something was beginning. Redemption, as it turned out, didn't come with applause or a headline. It didn't come wrapped in a court ruling or dressed in the crisp blue of a uniform. It came quietly in early mornings and uncomfortable conversations, in eyes that no longer looked away, and in actions taken without being asked. For Brandon Coyle, redemption began, not with proving he was right, but with accepting that he had been wrong. Weeks had passed since the hearing. He no longer put on a badge. The uniform hung untouched in his closet like a photograph of someone he used to be. His days were now spent behind a desk in community affairs, away from the field, away from the noise. But in that quiet, something unfamiliar began to grow reflection. At first, he had resisted the retraining. He had sat in those sessions with his arms crossed, watching videos and listening to instructors talk about implicit bias, about race, about history, he had once dismissed as irrelevant to his job. But as stories emerged, real lived stories, from men and women who had been stopped, dismissed, or humiliated, something shifted. The discomfort no longer felt like an attack. It felt like clarity, like truth finally stepping into a room that had waited too long in silence. He thought often about Malcolm Ayers, not just about the day he stopped him, but about how Malcolm had never raised his voice, about how he held space in a room without demanding it, about how he had delivered truth, not as a weapon, but as a mirror. Brandon had never seen a man move like that through the system, unafraid, uncompromising, and wholly uninterested in revenge. It had made him wonder, what does real power look like when it doesn't need to punish? Brandon reached out once, not for apology, but to listen. He found Malcolm's contact through the oversight board and wrote a simple email. He didn't expect a reply. But a week later, one came. Malcolm agreed to meet him not at an office or a station, but at a local youth center on the south side of Savannah. Brandon arrived early, unsure of what to expect. Inside, he found a group of teens gathered around laptops, editing a video project on community voices. One wall displayed portraits of local leaders, some known, some unsung. Among them was a new addition, a photograph of Malcolm taken by a student captioned only with the words, "Truth with Patience." When Malcolm entered, he didn't offer small talk. He simply nodded and gestured for Brandon to follow him into a side room. "I didn't come here to fix anything," Brandon said after a pause. "I just wanted to understand." Malcolm studied him for a moment, then replied, "Understanding isn't the end. It's the beginning. What you do next, that's where redemption lives." They talked for almost 2 hours, not about the past, but about possibility, about what it would take to rebuild trust in a city where suspicion had been the default, about how hard it was to change a system from the inside, but how necessary it was that someone tried. When Brandon left that day, he didn't feel lighter, but he did feel grounded. Not forgiven, but seen, and that was a start. In the months that followed, he began volunteering at the same youth center. He didn't wear a title. He didn't speak about reform. He just showed up week after week, tutoring kids, fixing lights, repainting walls, listening more than talking, learning what community looked like when it wasn't behind a badge. And slowly, his presence changed. The kids stopped seeing him as the cop. They saw the man who knew how to listen, who admitted what he didn't know, who had once made a mistake and had chosen not to disappear from it. Elsewhere, Malcolm continued his work, testifying at hearings, advising departments, mentoring young advocates who didn't want to burn the system down, but wanted to rebuild it with fire that healed instead of destroyed. He didn't keep in touch often, but every so often he'd receive an update from the center, a note from a student, a flyer from a new program, a photo of Brandon smiling awkwardly beside a mural painted by the kids. One evening, Malcolm visited the center again, unannounced. Brandon was there covered in paint, helping hang a sign that read, "Community is a verb." Their eyes met across the room. Malcolm walked over, looked at the sign, then at Brandon. "You're still here?" he said simply. Brandon nodded. "I figure if I'm not part of the solution, I'm just history." Malcolm didn't smile, but his eyes softened. "Redemption isn't a finish line," he said. "It's just choosing better every day." And in that moment, surrounded by laughter art and the quiet hum of a community stitching itself back together, it became clear Sometimes the greatest justice isn't what the law delivers, it's what a person chooses when no one is watching. And redemption. It doesn't always wear a badge. It wears intention. It wears humility. It wears time. And sometimes, if we're lucky, it wears change. In the city of Savannah, what began as a routine traffic stop spiraled into a reckoning that no one, least of all Officer Brandon Coyle, could have foreseen. What he saw that morning was a suspicious figure in a coat. What he didn't see was Malcolm Ayres, a quiet, composed man with a past in oversight, a man who had been profiled too many times to react with outrage. But when the cuffs clicked and the system moved as if it always had the right to, Malcolm didn't resist. He waited, because he knew what Brandon did not, that power once challenged with truth has no place to hide. Through hearings, testimonies, and the slow grinding process of accountability, the truth emerged not just about one mistake, but about patterns long ignored. The story unfolded not with drama, but with depth. Julian York, Alan Rivers. Faces that had once been blurred into statistics came forward with clarity, their voices revealing not singular incidents, but a culture of assumption. And at the heart of it all was a question we too often ignore. Who pays the price for our comfort? Brandon's fall wasn't publicized in headlines, and his redemption didn't come with applause. But it came through small steps first, in listening, then in change. He showed up in places he had once avoided. He asked questions he once believed he already had the answers to. And he learned what Malcolm had always known, that dignity cannot exist where power is never questioned. This story isn't about heroes or villains. It's about people flawed learning and capable of more. It reminds us that transformation doesn't begin when we're caught. It begins when we decide to see what we've refused to. And redemption. It's not a gift handed down. It's a choice made again and again, even when no one is watching. So what can we take from this? We live in a world shaped by systems, some designed to protect others quietly, built to exclude. But within each of us lies the power to ask better questions, to pause before assuming, and to speak up when silence feels safest. Whether you wear a uniform, carry a title, or simply move through the world, you shape it. With every choice, every interaction, every moment of discomfort, you decide to confront or ignore, you shape it. Let this story be a reminder that change is possible not just in policy, but in people. Not overnight, but over time. Through effort, through empathy, through truth. If this story moved you, if you saw yourself in it, or someone you know, help us keep sharing voices that need to be heard. Like this video. Subscribe to the channel. Share it with someone who still believes change is impossible. Because the more we listen, the more we learn. And the more we learn, the more we grow. And that's what we're here to do, together.